Well, hello. Hello, Tish.
Hi, Greg. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
It's a beautiful day here in Ohio, so it's good.
Is two Buckeyes this week. So,
Ooh.
wow, I'll tell you, how lethal is that?
I was going to say, how lucky is the public?
Well, that's right. That's right. That's right. Good to have you join us this week. This is our 10th week, I think, our 10th weekly edition of
Yeah,
Making Sense with Move to Amend. Thank you all out there for being a part of this effort, at least this week. Hopefully, some of you have taken in other programs. We come to you every Friday at this time, at least through, we're hoping, the end of September, and who knows beyond that. Um, we focus, as we do, on trying to, as the title explains, making sense of what transpired over this past week that we come into. And so, before getting into who we are and what we're going to do, just to say that Move to Amend, for people who may not be aware of, is organization dedicated to trying to amend the U.S. Constitution as a stepping stone to having fundamental uh, constitutional transformation. The specific way that we are initially calling for the amending of the Constitution is to pass what we call the We the People Amendment, HJR 48, that would end or abolish corporate constitutional rights in all of their forms, not just political free speech, as well as money being defined as political free speech. It is important to us that we focus on that sort of inside strategy, but we know to bring about any change, as has been the case from day one in our country, as well as basically every country throughout the eons on this planet, to bring about fundamental, bottom up, democratic, authentic, inclusive, just change, you have to have a movement. And it's got to be authentically democratic, it has to be authentically inclusive. And that is why we focus so much, not just rhetorically, but actually in building and in educating and organizing and creating, in trying to focus on anti-oppression and political education, in trying to come together and act in solidarity with those who have been historically oppressed in this country, which actually goes back to day one in this country, as well as many other important principles, including the purpose of this gathering, which is political education. We have to make sure we get on the other side of the learning curve about how we got into this mess and what it's going to take to get out of it. So that's who we are and what we try to do. And we're very fortunate this week to have, I think for the first time in our 10 weeks, someone who is not directly connected to Move to Amend, but certainly works in parallel, she and the work of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and that is Tish Odell. So welcome, Tish. Please say something about yourself, how long you've been connected to CELDEF, what CELDEF is. Go.
Great. Thanks, Greg. I was laughing as you're introducing me. As the first time someone outside, I'm like, I'm used to being called an outside agitator, so that's pretty funny from the outside. But yeah, so I've been with CELDEF about 8 years now, and I'm in Ohio as well as Greg, and I started in my own community. CELDEF is the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which is a nonprofit public interest law firm. And it was my community facing urban drilling back in 2011. I on all the channels that I thought I was supposed to go through, contacting my local electeds and going to the environmental protection agencies and all the places I thought were there to protect us, and found out, there was no protections for our community from this industrial, I guess, harm coming into the community. And so learned very quickly about the system, the process, and I actually ran for office thinking, well, if I was an elected, that I could fix the problem. Learned all about the electoral process really quick and how money controls that. And someone in a campaign, it was a campaign meeting, actually stood up and said, have you ever heard of CELDEF? Oh. And I hadn't. So I went home and Googled them and contacted them, and Ben Price called me right away. And so he came out to Broadview Heights, and we the rest is history, I guess. So I've been with them ever since, trying to help other communities realize, like you said, so much of the education is we don't even understand the system. I mean, we've been propagandized, the media, brainwashed, all this stuff. So it's really difficult to try and understand even where you are before you can try to get out and make change.
Absolutely. Absolutely, no question.
And so I really appreciate you having me on the show. You're right. We definitely do, work in parallel, because corporate rights and personhood and all that stuff, money and politics, is very much part of the system that keeps communities from making change.
Absolutely. And so hopefully we can get into some instances where the corporate constitutional rights and money in elections rears its anti-democratic head that is harmful to people, places, and the planet, and the importance of understanding, the present and the past. Who was it, Orwell, who said that those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future? It's so important that we sort of understand how we came from, because it's where we're going, where we're headed. And so an important feature of both of our organizations' work is to do political education that is not only being mindful of what's happening now, but how we got into this fix, and how, it wasn't really intended to some extent to be as bad as it is. In some extent, it's always been as bad as it is, but we need to understand that. So,
well, that's really important, because you'll hear them say all the time that the system's broken and that we need to fix it. And we say all the time, that's not true. The system's fixed, and we need to break it and create something better that actually works to protect the 99% and the environment. So, when we're trying to tweak something that was never set up to work for us, that's why we run into so many problems.
That's right. Absolutely. So before we get into it real quick, just wanted to acknowledge Alfonso Saldana, who is our tech person, who is lurking somewhere off of visual, but keeping us on track. And he will be occasionally listing various links. So pay attention to those on the screen of different links to move to amend pages and opportunities to become more involved in other things. And also just wanted to acknowledge those of you out there. Feel free to chime in with a comment, a question, a concern, a consternation, a query, whatever the case may be that comes to mind. We want to hear where you are coming from, observations you have, any things that may not immediately be clear, that we can at least try to reduce the confusion a little bit, if not more than that. So anyway, we do have a few issues we want to touch on, as well as maybe some good news, as well as some announcements. First thing I wanted to talk about, we're going to kind of go back and forth here between Tish and myself, is I think to some extent we have dealt with this almost every week, and that is the status of the federal stimulus, which is just grisly as can be, has been in hiatus for the last couple of weeks, as our friends in the U.S. Senate have been on vacation. And they plan to be coming back on Tuesday, day after Labor Day, where they will be taking up a bill that was sitting in dormancy, collecting cobwebs, and it was from the start a bill that was woefully inadequate compared to the House bill called the HEROES Act that was passed back in, when was that now? In May, I believe, which was in of itself, certainly by comparison to the Senate bill, better, but as far as what is needed, certainly not adequate, but it's what we got right now. And it certainly is a heck of a lot better than what the Senate is suggesting in terms of a couple of arenas. So we just wanted to quickly identify some of those areas that we need to be paying attention to and that may demand our input here over the next few days. Of course, what this bill is calling for in the Senate is just a partial example of what is needed. It will be dealing with, in one way, shape, or form, we'll see how significant funding for the post office and voting by mail. It also will, at least Trump and his cronies are talking for and calling for funding for schools to be to be kept open and to be safe. And how much they're talking about, who knows? That's up for grabs. But as far as the tens of millions of people who have been unemployed since the pandemic broke out, beginning in March or little thereafter, the real key interests in all of this is how much money is actually going to be going for actual financial help. To what extent will there be a second round of a one-time payment? Will it be $1,200 more or less? Will there be this ongoing unemployment insurance? Of course, the first round was $600 per week on top of whatever state unemployment insurance was. The Republicans in their bill are talking about $300 or thereabouts. Of course, Trump, as you may know, somewhat confusingly, made an executive order in the early part of August saying, we're going to redirect money from disaster protection under FEMA and give states $400. They have to come up with $100, 25%, but we'll give $300. And some of that has been messed with where some states are already getting the $300. And I guess those states don't have to come up with the extra 100. So there's that to be concerned about. Rob Portman, our wondrous senator here in Ohio, is calling for, it's not in the current Senate bill, but who knows, maybe it will be included during the negotiations, a $400, $450 back to work per week stipend for a number of weeks until people, as sort of an inducement or incentive to go back to work. Who knows whether that will make it in the bill and whether that will even be, very desirous given how dangerous many workplaces are perceived of as being. And we can get into, other aspects of this bill that the Senate is talking about, the Paycheck Protection Program for small businesses that in the first round went, to many small businesses, but many billions of dollars ended up bailing out and giving loans, if not grants, to large businesses, and many of them going to banks, many of them going to oil and gas corporations, tax loopholes going to oil and gas corporations and the like. And then the last thing that is up for grabs, that is sort of a red line for Republicans, Mitch McConnell in particular, is this corporate immunity. He wants blanket corporate immunity having to do with, if people go back to work or if consumers go back to shopping, or people who are in nursing homes or students going back to colleges or universities. If they get sick, all of these institutions want to be immune from having to be responsible, having to be accountable. Not, if you are protecting yourself and you're following whatever rules are being set up and people get sick, that's one thing. You would not be held accountable in that case. But what they want immunity for is across the board. If you get sick for whatever reason, including if you were derelict. And they want that immunity to be retroactive, going back to the beginning of or the end of last year. And they want that immunity to go forward for another 4 to 5 years. So those are a number of the provisions that are out there that are quite divergent in who they are protecting and who they are not. Basically, who they are not protecting is low, moderate income people, average people, people without a lot of wealth, people who are not contributing or donating or investing in public officials and politicians, who these programs are going to benefit, as they oftentimes have been up to this point. Certainly the CARES Act and the like is disproportionately the well-to-do and corporate entities. So it's up to us. I mean, again, this is just an example, is it not, of the priorities that are so tipped, those scales so tipped in the direction of protecting corporate entities and protecting the plutocrats and not protecting the average ordinary people, particularly those who are disproportionately of low income. And of course, we know people of color, children, seniors, and the like. So, and that has to do, does it not, with one of the key issues that Move to Amend focuses on and what SELDF focuses on, corporate constitutional rights. They were never intended to be, but exist, and that serve as a shield to protect companies and use as a battering ram to knock down rules and laws that protect people and protect communities. So,
exactly. Yeah, I mean, and a lot of it people don't even understand. I mean, they're setting up, they take the little bit that the government's going to give them and think, oh, isn't that great? I mean, the politicians, they're doing it obviously for political reasons, but what they don't see, that's the part we hear about and see on the news. It's what's going on behind the scenes that we don't hear about, that the media doesn't report on. I mean, and I think that's even scarier. And I know one of the articles you had forwarded to me, Greg, was about the evictions, and that people are going to be facing with the pandemic. And so they're, it's piling up. If they're not getting a paycheck, obviously they can't pay rent. And so, they're going to give them relief, right? I mean, we'll let you not pay your rent. We'll do a moratorium through the end of the year. But then come the end of the year, you're going to have to pay all that back rent plus then your rent again. Like, who can do that? And plus that assumes that all landlords can also afford this, but there's small landlords who can't afford, they have to make their mortgage payments and they count on, well, that's not part of the relief package at all. The big ones that have a ton of money in the bank, they may be able to sustain. So this is, again, it's always the same. It's about shifting more and more of the wealth to that 1%, to the elite minority. And they don't care then if the renters can't, they get evicted come January 1st. They don't care if those small landlords, who maybe it's like someone who saved up and bought a single, rental property, if they go out, because guess what's going to happen then? Then there's going to be a glut on the market of all these properties, and guess who's going to buy them up at cheap prices? I sold real estate, for 8 years, so I know how this works. I mean, that's what they're doing. So they're setting it up behind the scenes already for that shift of more wealth to the wealthy. And we don't see that, though.
And they benefited. They've already benefited under the pandemic. If it stopped today, they would made out. I saw something where U.S. billionaires, since the beginning of the pandemic, their net worth has increased from 2.9 trillion to 3.5 trillion. So, the rest of us are just trying to, stay afloat, if that, without drowning. And
right.
Most are not. Most of us are not. And here they have profited from all of it because, again, the rules are stacked. And as many of us in the past weeks of Making Sense have spoken about, it's that shock doctrine approach that Naomi Klein in her book. Every time there is any kind of, whether it's human-made or natural disaster, here come the plutocrats, here come the private entities come in to try to take advantage of that and use it to gain either economic and or political power. And that's what it's all about, is gaining power, authority, control.
Yeah. It's corporate socialism. I love the way the word socialism, like if we say people, average people like me and you and our neighbors and our communities and all that, they need some help. Like in this pandemic, they've suffered. People are like, oh, well, that's socialism. We can't have that. That's a dirty word. But what they're doing, they're giving trillions to big corporations. That's corporate socialism, but they don't frame it that way. Again, language is very important in the words we use.
That's right. There's a question, Alfonso, I don't know where this came from. How do you feel about developing independently operating offices at the county level to act as HR? I'm not sure I know what that means. If whoever asked that question could elaborate a bit, would be helpful. I just may not be able to, I don't know.
See that one.
Oh, transparency and accountability to the employers of people like any other employer. Well, I talked to lawyers, people united at purchase. Okay. Well, certainly transparency and accountability are two absolutely essential ingredients for individuals and for those entities that individuals create. Whether those entities are public entities, truly public entities like governments, or whether they are public entities that are deemed more quote unquote private, like corporate entities. And those can be, not just business corporations, they can be nonprofits, they can be churches. All of these entities that have been created by we the people through charters, through law, are entities that should be accountable. And there's a distinction to be made between being accountable and responsible. Only human beings, I believe, can be responsible. But entities need to be accountable. All those entities that we create need to be accountable to us. And if they aren't, then we need to figure out what the heck is going on and how they have insulated themselves from transparency, from knowing what's happening. Imagine if we'd had transparency around the time of Enron or around the time of, all of this mischief making, Wells Fargo, and the millions of, literally millions of accounts that were created, bogus accounts, in which people didn't even know they had accounts and having to pay upwards. So it's just horrific.
Well, part of this is they've created, I don't know if that person is talking about, creating something different, which is good. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what they were talking about, but, that's what we need to do. We're so used to, going to the system for help, thinking it's there to protect us and, from financial stuff to environmental stuff, health stuff, whatever, but it's not. That's the system that's fixed, but yet we keep going there. And the idea of creating these alternative, agencies and even elections. I mean, we've talked about that before because face it, I mean, once it gets so corrupt and so it's like, what are we going to do? And we see them, they're closing, shutting the coffin closed, I guess, on everything. So it makes it very difficult for us to maneuver at all within the system to make change. If they control the elections and, the electoral part of it, if they control all the regulatory, they basically have all three branches. If they control the courts and the legislatures by buying our electeds, it seems pretty like hopeless. But other people have been here in the past. I mean, that's the other thing when you study history, we're not the first ones. And, they had all the same problems we did. They couldn't get their message out. The media was controlled by the wealthy. It always has been. But they created other ways to get information out. So, we need to consider that too. And maybe we need to consider alternative systems of our own, because we give credibility to these corrupt systems, the more we, and that's always, something like in both sides, like the two people sitting on each shoulder, saying to me like, well, how are we going to make change when we can't, get into the system at all? We don't have the funds. We don't have the money to get in and play the game that they've set up. But on the other hand, we can, and people in history and past movements have shown us that. I mean, women couldn't vote new people in, right, to give them the right to vote. They didn't have a vote. So
that's right.
We have to think more creatively.
Absolutely. And we've been trapped in just thinking sort of what exists now is the only way. Mm-hmm. And so, a lot of what this political education involves, and I know both of our organizations try to do that, is to first unlearn what we have learned.
Exactly.
Very important. So I just want to acknowledge a few folks here who've weighed in, said hi, Millie, hey, Millie, Jason, Jessica, Linda Jillison, who was on the call last week with Lawrence Abbott, doing their labor caucus tag team. Hello, Yolanda, and Caitlin, who it was commented on later by someone, did a fantastic job in speaking, representing Move to Amend on last weekend's National People's Party convention. So we look forward to connecting more with that. All right, what do you have, Tish, in terms of issues?
Well, I was just going to comment on the one, too, that somebody put in the chat there. It's not hopeless through contract law and our vote. We can vote out politicians. The problem with that is, the politician, I mean, when both parties, are part of the problem, and we see that over and over again. And so in Ohio, what we're facing, and because we've done a lot of these community bills of rights, plus other communities throughout the country, what we're seeing now, because we had a lot of people push to put things on the ballot, so create their own laws, direct democracy, and that they've been kept off the ballots. So when you start thinking about that, I mean, our vote, of course, voting is important, and it should be one vote, one person, right? But the problem is now what they're going to is who decides what goes on the ballot that you get to vote on. If they pick the candidates that can go on and they pick the issues that can go on, how's that going to work? That's what I'm saying. We almost need to create our own people's election process where we have, I mean, of course, they'll say it doesn't count, but if that's an illegitimate election because we can't even get our people and our issues on the ballot, what good is that?
The whole idea of initiative and referendum and recall, these were considered to be three among several, small d democratic efforts of that populist and progressive era of the early 20th century that was meant to do an end run around the political machines of people. No, this is hands off. We are doing democracy, relatively speaking, democracy to whatever extent we've ever had it, which hasn't been grand by any means, right? Only white male property owners. But relatively speaking, it's a way to do small d democracy, doing an end run around the elected officials. But now what's happened in Ohio and elsewhere, because CELDF has tried to bring this to light, is they're trying to stick their fingers in that system and control that process. So it's not independent. It's not an end run. They're trying to rein that in so that they can control it.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. It started, in Cincinnati was the place here in Ohio that you're talking about, Greg, and Herbert Bigelow, and it was the Charter Party. And it was because of a corrupt state legislature. I mean, that they fought to get the right to initiative for the people because it was direct democracy, a check and balance on the government, on the legislature. And so, the interesting part of that is, every time the people have a movement and they think we won, I hear that all the time. Well, we need a win. We got to win something. And it's kind of funny, but then they think, well, okay, we won. So now we can go home because we won. And what we've learned, you can't. This never ends, because when we said at the beginning, it's about a power shift. It's a power struggle. If you've taken, and when the people did that and got the right to initiative, that was taking a little bit of power away from the corporate state. And so they fought to get it back. And that's what we're seeing now. And the people but they're not paying attention so much to that, so that's the problem.
Yeah, and unfortunately, not even every state has initiative, referendum, and recall. Something only like, 28?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 26 or 28. Yeah,
something like that. So all these other states don't even have that. If they want any kind of change, they're forced to go through the funnel of surrogates. And that's what elected officials are, right? Surrogates. Right. They're supposed to represent us, but we can't do it directly. We can't create things directly. That's what it was supposed to be through initiative, recall, and referendum. Which, wouldn't it be grand if we had that at the federal level? But we don't, right? That wasn't.
Well, that's what we always say. Those words we put in there, that the people have the right and the duty to alter, reform, or abolish any form of government that's no longer representing them or protecting their rights. Well, how are you supposed to alter or reform that government when you have to go through that government and get permission to make the change? It doesn't work. Right. So that's what we're facing. I don't know, some of you may, pardon, go ahead.
I was just reading a comment from Karen Grissom about post offices and she attended, here we go. History book by very much about giving all people information they needed to participate. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, post offices, as many people know, were also centers of banking, basic banking, that originated around the time of the Civil War and went right up through the early part of the 1960s. They provided just basic services, postal banking. There were millions of accounts. Something like 40%, I think, of people in this country at one time or another had post offices because they were all over the place, right? Post offices are both urban and rural. You don't have, as you have today, these banking deserts. And of course, the industry fought like blazes to get rid of it through lobbying because they were competition in the same way that credit unions were competition to commercial banks, and they tried to get rid of those, and they're still trying to get rid of those, but it's sort of watered down and come to some sort of Faustian bargain with credit unions, but they were successful in getting rid of postal banks. And that's one of the arguments being used now, and one of the reasons why the post office and postal workers are claiming we need the strong post office, not just the postal services, but given the fact that we have these financial deserts and how, these banks just rip people off, and you have, all of these predatory lenders out there that are charging huge amounts despite there being, I think Ohio has a 36% rate cap, but they get a way around it by, having all these financial banks where they end up, you get a predatory loan and you can be paying 130, 160%. If you had a postal bank, you might be able to get small loans through there. Who knows? So that's what the post office has been working on as giving a reason for their continued existence. And of course, the financial industry hates that with a passion.
Well, yeah, because who controls the financial industry? It's that 1% elite again.
Yep.
And yeah, again, behind the scenes, I mean, like I said, I was in real estate for a while. I mean, they created that whole housing bubble. And when I was shocked, to see how they would like give out loans. And now we've got the same kind of thing going on, but online. I know you sent that article about the Fintechs, they call them, and how they're giving loans to people online. I mean, it's like it's predatory lending, but in a different form. And I think it's going after a lot of the young people. And it just digs their hole deeper and deeper and deeper. I mean, and they're creating another bubble that's going to burst with that. And then we'll all, again, wind up paying the price of that. I'm just curious how long this, this trough that they keep taking from us, is going to exist, because it just keeps getting deeper.
Right. You brought up recently, or just a couple minutes ago, about the eviction moratorium that we do now have because of Trump, on September 1st, saying through the CDC that there was going to be a nationwide temporary eviction moratorium, and some of the problems that does raise in terms of, okay, that's well and good as far as it goes through the end of December, but it's not providing any funding to either renters or to homeowners to either pay their rent or pay their mortgages, which means, guess what? As you are, cheering in the new year of 2021, you're going to have to pay every nickel that you were not paying in rent or mortgage, plus probably fees or penalties on top of that. Who can do that?
Well, it makes no sense. It just defies. I mean, there's no common sense there. There's no logic to it. But it sounds good as a soundbite, on the news media at night, doesn't it? Like the government passes this, moratorium to give, people a break on paying their rent. I mean, it sounds great, but they don't know the details.
And so the House already has passed something calling for 100 billion in emergency rental assistance and 75 billion for homeowners. So that would be in addition to whatever it is you feel based on your needs. The Senate should pass that tries to raise the bar up to, again, not what it should be, high enough bar in the House, but nevertheless, it's what we're dealing with at the moment. On top of that, here we have a House bill. It was called the Emergency Housing Protection and Relief Act of 2020, 100 billion in rental assistance, 75 in homeowners. Contact your senators and say, in addition to, unemployment insurance extension and the one-time payment, this needs to be part of what happens. And not just forestalling paying up rental and mortgages, but we need relief, because banks certainly are getting relief.
Right.
They get all kind of relief. They've gotten relief through the CARES Act. They've gotten relief through the Federal Reserve creating upwards of $4.5 trillion out of thin air, upwards of like $13 trillion so far since about a year ago in September up to now.
Yeah, that article in September, it said just in 6 weeks, Wall Street got $6 trillion. So that's the other thing. They use such high numbers that for the common person, to us, it's all inconceivable. But, so 100 billion versus 6 trillion, it's like, yeah.
I know it's hard to keep the numbers straight, but there is a difference between a B in billion versus a T in trillion.
Right.
And, the Great Recession or Depression, whatever you want to call it, in 2007 and 2009, only because of Bernie Sanders, when he, forced a rider in some bill calling for the Fed to come clean, do we know that during that period, there was a $29 trillion amount of money that the Fed put out in loan assistance to the financial industry. 29 trillion. Yeah. Meanwhile, Main Street, side streets, back streets, all those people, so many people lost their homes from that. Same bloody thing is happening this time. But this time the banks didn't create the mess as they did in the foreclosures. They're just taking the pandemic and exploiting it.
Right.
As are the oil and gas corporations,
Mm-hmm.
which basically on their own, they would tank. They were having problems, and you know this better than I do because you've been following the fracking issue. You know, the oil and gas industry was headed toward an implosion before the pandemic, but they're trying to use now all of this, you know, relief money to get bailed out.
To keep bailing them out. Yep. Well, and what's interesting is, I don't know, you bring up another topic there because it's oil and gas, you know, and of course that's, you know, I saw an article, actually I got it in my email this week, and it was from 350.org, and it was like, this is great. Exxon, the world's largest company, is being kicked out of the Dow. And it was like, wow, this is great. Look at all this historic moment. Look at what we've done, you know, with all your work. So give us money because we've done this. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I always like look these up, and I'm like, well, what does that mean exactly? And so, I mean, actually getting deleted from the Dow isn't like a horrible thing. I mean, if you look at it in the past, there's been many companies, they've actually done lots of studies, and ones who've gotten kicked out of the Dow have done better than ones that have got added to the Dow. So it's not really, but it's that idea in our heads. We love these sound bites, and, you know, they sound great, but they're not actually changing anything. And it's just all false narrative. And it's a way, I think, for, you know, nonprofits, they've corporatized activism, unfortunately, like they've corporatized everything in our society and culture. And it, you know, gives this impression of a win that a nonprofit needs in order to then get more money, right, from funders. So it's not really true, but it makes people think that there's something happened there.
They are losing, though. They are losing money. They are losing power. It's not happening fast enough, quick enough, given their contribution, the oil and gas industry, to the climate crisis. And a lot of that has to do with their corporate constitutional rights, both their ability to buy, rent, lease, or retain public officials through their campaign contributions or investments, but also their ability to conceal, to use the First Amendment right not to speak, to shield and prevent their pre-knowledge for decades that they knew that the burning of fossil fuels was contributing to the climate crisis. So they've been very effective at preventing and profiting from and preventing knowledge, widespread knowledge of what they are doing, while extremely profitable to them, with all of these externalities, all of these costs, in particular, enormous, detrimental, existentially life-preserving costs to the environment and to potential, at least, living of human beings. I'm sure the roaches will continue to survive, right, and others, other sort of single-cell, you know, beings and organisms, but any sort of advanced forms of life are just going to be extremely stressed. And it's because of the oil and gas industry and because of their corporate constitutional rights. So that is why, again, we do what we do, that it's not enough to elect better people. It's not enough to pass a law. It's not enough to pass a regulation thinking any of those things are going to help. Not when some of these fundamental rules are the way they are.
Right. And it's about systemic change. And part of what I've worked on a lot and CELDF's working on is rights of nature. So, you know, what that's doing is trying to attack the system. Right now, nature has no rights in our legal system. Corporations, as we well know, all of us on this, you know that they have a ton of, you know, constitutional rights, which is not anywhere in the Constitution. To level the playing field a bit, that's why we're looking at nature, instead of looking at nature as simply property to be owned and destroyed, that it has a right to live, exist, flourish, thrive, be healthy. I mean, we're fooling ourselves if we think we can be healthy with a dirty and sick environment. So, you know, that's part of it. In Toledo, they passed that first rights of nature law for a specific ecosystem, which is Lake Erie. And I'm going to maybe say something that's unpopular, but I'm used to doing that. But not, you know, so people want to look at renewable energies as like, this is the big savior, but we have to change the system. And so the system is, like you're talking about, Greg, the corporations have these rights. So the Exxon, the BPs, they're buying up a ton of the renewable markets. To give you a specific example, they want to put tons of wind turbines, industrial wind turbines, into Lake Erie. Well, each one of these industrial machines holds 400 gallons of motor oil. They have to get somehow the energy produced out there, right, into a grid so they can sell it as a commodity. It's never been done in fresh water before. This is the drinking water supply of over, I think it's almost 4 million people. And it's an experiment. And when you look at their permit application, it says no environmental impact. I mean, common sense has to tell you, you're digging up the bottom of Lake Erie, has a ton of PCBs and other toxins at the bottom. That cable has to be run. Motor oil is going to leak into the lake. I mean, there's all kinds of issues with this. So it's about, again, the system, the community, the people aren't being asked. This is to send the power, put it on a grid, consider it a commodity, and sell it somewhere else to the highest bidder so a corporation can make the profit. Completely different. So the problem that we're looking at is like, it should be more decentralized. It's this idea of this corporate control centralizing, and it comes back to the post office. There's certain things. Is water a human right? Is the ability to have heat in the wintertime, is that a right? Is that, certain things, that's why we had them as public utilities, because it was not supposed to be about all the profits and return, of investor returns. That's not why those things were set up. It was that all people kind of should have access to these things. And we've gotten so far away. So I know a lot of people think that, renewable energy is like going to be the savior, but we're not digging at the elephant in the room, which is our consumption and how the system is set up to allow those same, you're just changing the face of the corporate exploiter and polluter to someone else.
That's right. And I think what CELDF has done in terms of trying to promote these community bill of rights and rights of nature, sort of beginning in this very globally aware way, because the rights of nature of the Lake Erie Bill of Rights got attention at the United Nations. So this is, and it's not the only place, because other nations, right, Ecuador and other countries have embedded in their constitution to some extent something having to call for lifting up the rights of nature in general, or river or watersheds. I mean, this is really groundbreaking stuff, as is what we believe Move to Amend is in trying to get communities to pass ballot initiatives calling for, they don't have quite the umph in the teeth of what community bill of rights are. They're trying to change the culture, which in of itself is important, to help people at a local level get on these items on the ballot, calling on their federal representatives to say, we need a constitutional amendment to say, no, corporations are not persons. They don't have inalienable constitutional rights. Money is not equivalent to free speech. Hundreds of communities have passed this across the country. Hundreds of other communities have passed, gotten their city councils, county councils to pass this. Hundreds of organizations have taken a stance and endorsed, just as we know when it comes to CELDF, scores of communities have weighed in to this, and it's much harder to do what you're trying to do per community than what we're trying to do. That's why I think, these efforts are complementary, because they're trying to, we're definitely all outsiders to a certain extent, but we're appealing to things that are basic and elementary that very much are inside. Most people believe we should have the right to decide what goes on in our communities, what goes on in our, with our families. We should have the right to decide across the board, and we don't. So in that case, it's very, quote unquote, I think, paradoxically radical, but conservative at the same time.
Right, exactly. And it's about expanding rights, because a lot of people worry that, you're going to then have communities that are going to pass laws, that are discriminatory and racist and all that. We already have that. But that this would be about expanding rights. So we are very careful and write that in. So in other words, if the federal government sets something as a floor, the rights you already have there, the state can expand on those, but it can't take them away. Same thing, that's how we view the local. The local can expand, but they can't take away rights or protections that people and the environment already have.
Yeah, and we believe very much the same, that this is just a stepping stone to more fundamental constitutional renewal that, oh my goodness, you start reading the original Constitution and the guys, and they were all guys, wealthy guys at that. A couple good things, no question about it, but many things that need to be rethought, rewritten, transformed pretty fundamentally. And so we are looking at ways to sort of invite people to do that, using this We the People Amendment as certainly a way to begin thinking and talking about it. And we need it, to be sure, but that certainly is not enough. This needs to operate as well in sort of a parallel track. So, good news. Anything that came across your, I don't know, what you read, what you saw, what you heard, what you've seen this past week that gives you hope, that is uplifting, anything like that?
Well, I mean, we have tonight the premiere of the movie Invisible Hand, which is a movie about rights of nature. So I'm very encouraged. I still have lots of, and all of us at CELDF, we're getting calls and emails all the time for communities that want to engage in this work. I think that's one thing that I think COVID has really made people realize, that we can't be relying constantly on the government to protect us and provide everything we need. So they've had to do for themselves. So in a way, for me, that's really good to see, because people are, like you said, Greg, it's unlearning what we know. And sometimes things that happen outside of our work and activism and all that are making that happen. And I think between the climate issues that are happening, between COVID, people are realizing that, hey, democracy is something we have to participate in. It's not like a spectator sport. People say that all the time. And it's not just about voting, once a year and casting a ballot. It's much more than that. And people, maybe that's because they're home, I don't know, and they're reading online more, but they are becoming much more engaged, which I think is a huge positive. We plant seeds, and then hopefully taking those, and you're seeing them sprout all over the country and even the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Alfonso, I just texted or chatted you the link to that film, if it's possible for you to put in the comments. Anyone who has an opportunity this evening to check out that film, please do that. Invisible Hand.
Yep. It's the premiere. Yep.
Terrific. I have a couple of things I wanted to say. One is happy Labor Day weekend. Labor Day is, one of those days. It's different, our Labor Day, than others. That's more May Day, but be that, there's a long backstory to that. But I think what's hopeful is the fact that people in general are rising up and resisting in ways that, particularly Black Lives Matters, historic in terms of numbers, in terms of places. And when you add to that the people who are doing strikes for boycotts or rental assistance or higher pay for doing work that is dangerous in this pandemic times, labor is weighing in different ways. Labor is more diverse than it's been in maybe ever in terms of representing not just white, industrial middle income and middle-aged people. There's now Black, Brown, there's younger people, and they are working maybe more in solidarity with non-labor people, with communities of faith, with good government groups, with others, like never before. Part of it is sort of out of desperation. We have to do that. We're not strong enough, any one of us, contextually or constituency-wise. But it is, people are starting to see the interconnections. So that's very positive. And labor, has a strong history. Again, it's been somewhat of a checkered one. Labor didn't always represent people of color or women, people who were not labor. But they're doing that more now. And it's worth remembering that labor got its start, from my reading of history. First early labor unions in New York were organized to promote two conditions. One, 8-hour workday, and two, free public education. something to remember and think about in these days of every, the corporate crowd trying to privatize or corporatize through charters, education. The importance of having free public education to make sure people are sort of at the same educational level was extremely important in the eyes of working people to have, and labor unions to have anything approaching a functional, quote unquote, democracy. So labor, and if there are labor events going on, there's something going on in Cleveland this weekend. I plan to go to it tomorrow. Something taking place in your community, try to take that in and draw and form solidarity. The only other thing I wanted to say that's I think hopeful that I ran into this week is in doing some research for our Model Codes corporate group. We're trying to come up with sort of some principles, alternatives of a post-corporate constitutional rights world. I went back and looked at our research we did here in Ohio of citizens over corporations, and we're talking about banks and how banks are so powerful today and how they get away and, they've hijacked the Constitution and the like. Well, it wasn't always that way. The banks in particular, among any subset of corporations, were extremely of concern to people, not just in Ohio, but in many other places. And so the effort to initially sort of make sure that banks were under the thumb of we the people, relatively speaking, was extremely important. So much so that charters, original charters, and that's how companies first got their existence to do business through individual charters, was very important. And after individual charters existed, in these charters, banks, their books had to be open. They couldn't own more land than they, needed, all kind of stuff. After those individual charters, there were things called general incorporation laws, where states would pass these laws for a whole series, so for a whole category of corporations. So one for railroads, one for banks, one for mills, one for, you fill in the blank. And so anyway, the banking law for Ohio that was passed in 1842, okay, besides saying that if you, bank executive, didn't follow what we as a state legislature decide should be the case, not only will your charter be repealed, but here's what else has happened. Section 8, punishment of officers. Any president, director, trustee, or other officer consenting to a violation of any of the provisions above shall be fined and imprisoned in the cell or dungeon of the county jail and fed on bread and water only. I like that. Thank you. Somewhat deterrent. And also punishment for embezzling. Those individuals shall be imprisoned in the penitentiary and kept at hard labor. So, you just had this reality at the time. In one other section, banks to pose up for public inspection the names of its stockholders, their residences, and the amount of stock paid in, and subject at all times shall be in public inspection. Their books shall be public at some convenient place in the public banking room and shall be published once every 3 months in some newspaper published in the county where such banks may be. Banks were considered to be the most sort of dangerous, can't imagine why, of any corporation of the day. And it's worth keeping that in mind today, because what's going on today, whether it's the oil and gas corporations, whether it's pharmaceutical corporations, whether it's financial corporations, those entities that we think are impervious to change, that their power, their authority just didn't drop out of the sky from Mars. It was intentional, it was deliberate, it was political. What has been done can be undone, and at one time, it wasn't the case. And so we can change it back. It's up to us to do it. And so that's where understanding how we got into this fix is so important.
Right. And I would add to that, when we get pushback from them, that means you're on the right track. We a lot of times think that's a bad thing, but that's actually a good thing, because that means we must be going after it the right way, because they're having, an issue with what we're doing. And, I just want to add too, a lot of this has to do with laws. Laws should reflect the values of the community and the society and the culture. And right now we have laws being written by corporations that we, the people, are following. And we're being really obedient to the laws corporations are writing. And those laws are written to reflect their values. And I think people have to remember that. And so we have to push back against all these laws because they're not written for our benefit. They're written for their benefit. And that's part of what a lot of our work is about in the community bills of rights. And even what you're talking about, Greg, and reading that, you know, those were the values of the times. And our values need to be reflected in our laws and in our constitutions. And, you know, we have all these declarations. Well, it's like there's a real disconnect here between what I think a lot of people value, you know, clean water, clean air, the people being able to make decisions, healthcare, a decent paying job that they can pay their bills, what's actually happening in reality and what the laws are written are actually doing. So I think, you know, people are starting to put this all together, the puzzle pieces, hopefully, and all of us together, the work you're doing, the work we're doing, all these other organizations out there that are trying to make these changes, it all does make a difference.
Yeah, I'm looking real quick at the comments here. Agree that certainly Glass-Steagall and the repeal of that certainly worsened things. A few years after that is when we had the crisis, but restoring it isn't enough. It would be better than what we have, but it's fundamentally not enough because we still don't have control over what those entities do. No question about it. I agree.
Well, that's one thing we do too. We always like doubt ourselves. Like we can't do that. That's the first thing we say. Like when I go into a community and I go, "What do you want?" And then they'll tell me, and then they'll go, "Yeah, but we can't do that."
You're right.
Like, why not? Because it's illegal. It's like, oh my God. Yeah.
We have to stop ourselves and think what we can do is in this little box, and this little box has been defined by them.
Right.
This is what you can do, and that box gets smaller and smaller. No. Enough of that.
Yep.
Anonymous says, we are the CEOs of the business and government. I don't know if CEOs, but we have the right to demand for an applicant. We have the right to decide what goes on, whether you want to call that CEO or having a PhD in what it's like to live in this society. Hey, we know best. And so we should have a right to decide what's going on. Okay, a few announcements coming up this week. And maybe as we go through some of these, Alfonso will add these links to the chat and to the screen if I can find them, if I haven't eliminated them, or where the heck is it? Here we go. You can sign our petition. Please do so. It's how we gain power and numbers when we go and approach our elected officials to say, hey, there's X number of people in your congressional district. You can do that by going to movetoamend.org/petition. Please donate what you can by going to movetoamend.org/donate. In these perilous economic times, it's all the more important to be not only, sustainable, but hopefully have enough money to pay ourselves, which we don't at the moment. So if you can help us out, that's great. And, we are politically and economically independent. That is by choice. We don't accept a nickel from big foundations, from corporations, from government, from political parties, from plutocrats, you name it. So we rely on those we depend upon. Check us out. The Movement Education Program is something that we believe is extremely important. Jessica Munger on this call, who was projected earlier, is sort of one of the key people associated, the key person helping put that together. It's a way for us to get on the other side of the learning curve of how we got into this mess, both in terms of corporate injustices as well as oppressions, and how we get over that, how we come together and organize. So please check that out. Endorse Move to Amend and the We the People Amendment by going to our webpage of movetoamend.org/endorsements. There's information on, if you're part of any group, please approach them and see if they would be willing to endorse us. Labor Day, again, is Monday, September 7th. Our next Make Sense call is next Friday, September the 11th. Why did September the 11th stick out? Oh, yeah, the anniversary. Move to Amend national presentation with our national director, Caitlin Sapoki-Belknap, sort of the state of Move to Amend in the new fiscal year, beginning October 1 is October 1. So check that out. Cell Deaf, The Invisible Hand, and you have a webinar series coming up, don't you?
Yep, we had the first one last night. The second module is next week, next Wednesday. So yes, we put that in the chat. So
okay, that's in the chat. And the only other thing I wanted to say is, again, I don't know how to put something directly in the chat. It's my Luddite DNA, I guess. So once again, Alfonso sent something to you to quickly, if you don't mind, putting in the chat. It was last week that Linda, I think it was Linda, made a suggestion of a reading. We want to make a suggestion of a reading. I think it's one that both Celdef and I and Poklad have found useful in previous iterations of educational webinars and the like. It's a piece that was done by Jane Ann Morris, a corporate anthropologist to be named. And she put together something that is just, it's not that long, well worth the read, that lays out sort of the kind of fix that we're in, if you want to talk about fixes, and how the whole system is sort of rigged to benefit people and to keep us sort of on the edges and going through the regulatory apparatus. It's called Help. I've been colonized and I can't get up. Take a lawyer, an expert to a hearing, and call me in a decade.
Love that piece. And I just realized that she did it. She had an original version. The one in 1998 was actually edited. She had to tone it down. And that there's a piece she put out 4 years later, which was the original one. And I like that one even better. It's a great piece. But it was too radical for Earth Journal or whatever it was.
Yeah,
in 1998.
If it wasn't, I don't know if it was listed in the chat or not, but you can get it by going to her Facebook, her website, democracythemepark.org. I love that because, she was
a great piece.
Belief that, that's what our democracy is, a theme park. Mm-hmm. It's like you go to a theme park, you sort of go down the promenade. It looks real, but when you walk behind, right, when you walk behind the frontage, you just see the whole thing is held up by 2x4s. And that's kind of what she says, and many of us believe, is democracy. You show up.
Pay attention to that over there, the flashing lights, but not what's going on behind the scenes.
Or you show up to a polling place and you push some buttons or pull some levers, but sometimes it's not even connected to anything. It's just So anyway, but it's a good piece. Do check it out, and it's the recommended reading for this week. So, with that,
thank you.
Anything else?
Thanks, Greg, for having me on. Yeah, thank you. This was great.
People who want to get more information from CellDef, go to where?
Celldef.org. I can put that in chat too.
How do you do that? I didn't figure that out. So.
No, you have to give it to Alfonso, I think, and then he puts it in.
Oh, okay, yeah. All right. So, thank you so much, everyone. Do check in next week, and thank you so much for attending this week. Have a good Labor Day weekend. Be radical, and take good care.
Yes, make good trouble. Bye.
Peace.